All right. So in the last video, I showed you how to search for your articles, specifically focusing on how to find your meta-analysis for a relational research question. And in this video, I'm going to show you a little bit more about how to actually interpret your articles, what to look for, what are the most important sections of the paper that you'll need to conduct your rapid evidence review. One thing I think is important to mention when you're reading academic articles is that you don't necessarily need to worry about every single detail in each article. There's some things in there that are extremely complex that are only of interest to specialists that are in the field. And for you, you can read strategically to find the information you need in order to help you write your rapid evidence review and answer your question that's related to your organizational problem. So in our last video, I kind of explained the process of searching and indicated how searching can be an iterative, it's an iterative thing where you're adding search terms, taking out search terms to increase or decrease the number of articles that you find. And we were focusing specifically on finding a meta-analysis on burnout. And so we focused on these articles that had burnout in the title, and we used meta-anal to be the root word that would have anything after it that kind of starts with this beginning, and the asterisk tells us that we're truncating here. So meta-analytic, meta-analysis, meta-analyses. Sometimes some papers have two meta-analyses in them, so that might be something that comes up. But we know that meta-analyses always have this term in the title, so we restricted our search to meta-analytic or meta-analyses or analysis in the title. Then we also wanted to exclude these special populations. So we don't want anything about nursing or healthcare or education. And this time while I'm searching, I have used these truncation functions to exclude anything that kind of comes after this as well. So educators, education. And you could still add your organization or manager terms as well to try to restrict it to things in industry rather than in other populations. But I think having this not search term gets me far enough in this case. You will want to remember to try to restrict your search to academic articles. This isn't really taking anything out at this point, but sometimes you may find instead of saying academic journal, it'll say conference proceeding. You don't want to use a conference proceeding. You don't want to use a dissertation. In these sections, it'll show you that. Okay, so from this process, we found an article that I liked. It was related to job demands and resources and employee engagement and burnout. So in this study, they're probably going to be studying more than just burnout. That's okay. We're going to read strategically to find what we want. If this was a research question that you were looking at, you would also find all these other meta-analyses that you could use as well. And that's totally fine. You don't have to just use one meta-analysis if there are many on your research topic. And with some of your topics, there will be many. You could use only meta-analyses if you wanted to, if they were related to your research topic. But I like this one. And I already have it open here. Anyway, when you're reading your articles, this page, this handout, will tell you all of the important things that you need to look for in each section. There's going to be terms you don't know. There's going to be things that seem a little bit complicated. Don't worry about that. We'll just look at the most important parts of the article. The abstract is something I encourage you to read. I encourage you to read all of. And make sure that your key variables, or in our case, just our one key variable, which is burnout, is in the abstract. They may have more things in there, that's fine. But we want to know that in this paper, they're going to, in some way, answer a research question, which is, how are we defining burnout? And what are our strongest predictors of burnout? This one in particular will be answered by a meta-analysis that looks at all kinds of correlates with burnout. as this one seems to based on the title, but we'll also along the way get this indication of how burnout is defined. And that's something I want you to look for when you're reading your meta-analyses. Just as a reminder, if you're not sure what different articles can do, there's a description of the articles. Here are the types of articles that you'll find and what kinds of questions they can answer. So one reason why I wanted to focus on meta-analysis is because it gives us an indication of, or can answer descriptive research questions, and it can answer the relational research questions. In our case, we're looking at multiple independent variables and which ones are the most strongly related to burnout, which is the thing we want to prevent or reduce. Okay, so with the article, we'll read the abstract. It gives you a brief synopsis of what the article is about, and we'll look for our search terms. So in this article, we already get a sense that burnout is relevant here. We know that it's a meta-analysis. And so here is why you want to use that truncation, because they said meta-analytic test. It's the same thing as a meta-analysis. But we know there's burnout. There's also engagement and some as another thing that they're explaining. But we see here that they're interested in job demands and resources. So that sounds broad enough that they're going to look at multiple predictors of burnout, but then we have this kind of extra dependent variable that we don't need to focus on. We don't need to focus on engagement. Just because it's in the paper doesn't mean we need to include it in our rapid evidence review. We read this and we see, okay, they're testing this theory and this model. We don't need to worry about that either. If you're curious about it, you can read it, but you don't necessarily need to be concerned with these theories and models and stuff. That's kind of more for a deep dive. If you're at all interested, you can go for it, but it's not necessary. They say that they use meta-analytic structural equation modeling, and that's something a little bit more complicated than just a typical meta-analysis. It's fine. It doesn't matter, because all you're going to look for in your meta-analyses and your primary studies, for the most part, is just one effect size between, or in this case, because we have a few independent variables, what we're going to look for is essentially a correlation as an effect size. That's the primary piece of information we want to find. And they'll still have this, as we'll see later. So I say this now just so that if you read something like this, don't get scared and concerned about it, because you'll still probably be able to find the effect size that you want. So then they kind of describe their results. They say demands and burnout were positively associated. That's helpful for us because it ties into our research question in terms of what is related to burnout. They're saying demands, job demands. All right, that makes sense. And resources and burnout were negatively associated. So there's a negative relationship between resources and burnout. A negative correlation is the statistical way of saying this. Then they start going into the relationships between resources and engagement. And we don't need to worry about that because we're not that interested in engagement. We're just interested in burnout. That's our one outcome variable that we want to focus on. Okay, so with that said, this is all good. It will help us answer our research question. We don't have weird populations that are not related to our research question that we see yet. You know, if this is said, this study was about nurses, then we would exclude it. If it didn't have the term burnout in it, we would exclude it. Or if it only looked at something specific in its relationship to burnout, we would probably exclude that too, because we want to know what the strongest predictors of burnout is. So the next thing that we want to look for is we want to read, in general, I would encourage you to read the introduction to give you a little bit of a sense of what the importance of this topic is. That can be helpful for you for writing your own introduction. And they're probably, again, going to say some things in there that, you know, maybe don't make that much sense because it's sort of like nerdy and not really related to if you're a practicing manager, what your goals are. That's okay too. But still, it can be helpful to read the introduction in general, overall. The other thing I want you to look for in the introduction is a definition of your key term. or any other terms of interest. So here we see burnout is defined here as a syndrome of weariness with work characterized by exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. So this is something that you would use in your rapid evidence review. You would define burnout at some point or another, whether it's a specific research question or it's just something you define in passing. You'll need to do it either way. In our case, we actually have this as a research question. So I would take note of this as an answer, as part of an answer to my research question. And in particular, I see here that there are 3 sub-dimensions that they mention: exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. And that, as I would find later, I know this because I know the literature, but as you would dive deeper into this research question, you would see that this is something that they commonly discuss in relation to burnout. So burnout is this higher order construct with 3 sub-dimensions, 3 symptoms, if you will, that kind of go together. Another thing to pay attention to when you find your definition of your construct is the citation that they use. This citation you could then go find and maybe read. Maybe this is something you want to add to your rapid evidence review. This is called backwards searching, where you find an article that is serving a purpose for you, and then you go backwards from the citations in this article, or the citations that this article cites, right? This citation here, and you can find that as a potential resource. So maybe I can just find it in Google Scholar. You're welcome to find it in the JMU database as well. But if you have something really specific, you're not necessarily going through the search process, Google Scholar works too. So here we kind of have this little article written that could maybe help us understand a little bit more about what burnout is and define it in our rapid evidence review or introduction. You can also, a better way to do this would be to look in the references and see the actual reference that they use. So here we have this reference. I'm not sure that that's the one I found. Okay, so that's a book. You could still, it seems like these are the seminal people who kind of started this. So maybe this article would still be helpful to use if you wanted to. Looks like it's been cited quite a bit. So if you wanted to, you could still use this other article. But it gave me a sense, even if I don't want to use this literal citation that they had in the paper itself, it still gave me a sense of who these authors are who kind of started the burnout research. Okay, and you could do the same for some of these other citations that they used. Maybe that 1997 one is a book, you don't want to get it, but maybe there's something else in there in this definition that is helpful. So this is why meta-analyses can be used to answer both relational research questions and help answer descriptive research questions. Ideally, what you would do is cite this when you're defining burnout and not the meta-analysis, because this is where the meta-analysis got this information from. But, it's, the point is you want to find some information about how to define this construct. Okay, so that's all good and well. Then as I'm reading along, I'm also kind of curious how they're defining job demands and resources. So that's what they're saying is predicting burnout, either decreasing or increasing burnout. So as I'm going along, I'm keeping my eyes open for that and seeing if there's anything that gives me an indication of what that might be. Here we might see they're maybe italicizing it potentially, but if I were reading this, I would find that actually they define these other variables right here in more detail. So here there's this definition: job demands refer to those physical, social, organizational aspects of the job that require sustained physical or mental effort. Okay, great. There's a definition of your other variables that you would want to describe briefly in your answer to your research question. And then you have job resources, referring to those aspects of the job that are functional in achieving work goals, stimulating personal growth and development, and reducing job demands and their associated physiological and psychological costs. Perfect. So that helps us have a sense of what it is they're talking about. And as I go further, this is, they're kind of getting into their model and the theory. Maybe it's interesting, but maybe it gets a little in the weeds. I would try to give it a read, see if there's anything helpful there that you can use in your rapid evidence review to explain this relationship, to describe it, right? To describe the findings. But it's not as important maybe as some of these other pieces of information that we'll find later. If you wanted to go into what these different types of job demands are, it looks like they go into that. That could be, if you're interested in including that, you could include it. So they describe 2 different types of stressors, different types of job demands. Maybe you're summarizing or reading this as well. Importantly, we would want to see in our hypotheses, or the hypotheses that they propose, that the outcome variable we're interested in is in the hypothesis. So they're predicting your outcome variable, much like you are stating it in your research question. So in this case, burnout is the outcome variable, and they're saying job demands, both challenges and hindrances, are positively associated with burnout. That's their estimation of what's going to happen. Then they say that job resources are negatively associated with burnout. Okay, great. That matches up with our research question. It's not that burnout is the predictor in these hypotheses and it's explaining something like turnover intentions. If we're saying burnout is an outcome variable in our research question, then we want burnout to be an outcome variable in our meta-analysis too. Okay. We already know that this is a meta-analysis, but if you weren't sure what kind of study you were looking at, there should be a description of it in the methods section. So, and you see here in the first sentence of the methods section that they talk about the fact that they did a meta-analysis. I don't want you to worry that much about the methods section, other than just identifying what kind of study it is. This might already be something that you know from the title or from the abstract, but if it's not, then you can check this section, and usually it'll say what type of study it is in the first couple of sentences. And the rest, you don't really need to worry that much about. There's a lot of details in there that are not particularly important for us in our purpose. This is nice actually, because they tell you what the different pieces of information that they get, but I also tell you how to interpret the effect sizes as well. So in their results section, they tell you these little things that help make sense of the results. But they might not do that, and that's totally fine. Instead, what we are now looking for is an effect size that explains the relationship between burnout and these predictors, the job demands and the job resources that they're saying are related to burnout. Usually in a meta-analysis, there's a table 1 that tells you the effect size between the variables of interest, or the variables in the meta-analysis. And it might not literally be table 1, but it might be table 2. It almost always is table 1, but every once in a while it's not. The point about this, or how you would identify it, is it's your meta-analytic results. And here we're seeing these aggregated correlations, basically, from all of the individual studies that were included in this meta-analysis. So how do we read this table? We see that these are relationships between demands, resources, and burnout. Those are the variables we're interested in, and we're not really interested in engagement because that's another outcome. Then we have the variables listed here as well. And then there's all of these numbers. What do these numbers mean? What are we looking at here? The note at the bottom of the table will help you understand the numbers a little bit more. K is the number of correlations used for the meta-analysis. That means the K is the number of studies that got aggregated to give you this overarching or this aggregate correlation. So in this case, we see 32 studies were aggregated to give us a relationship between these variables. So let me back up here actually, and let's learn about how we find the statistics related to the variables of interest for us. These are basically a correlation matrix where you have to cross your variables across this kind of x-axis here and the y-axis to find where they meet up. We're interested in burnout. So we don't need to know, for example, the correlation between demands and resources. That's the information that we're seeing here because in this column, this is all information pertaining to demands. And then we can cross demands over and we see, okay, these are the relationships between demands and resources. That's interesting kind of, but it's not related to our research question. So don't worry about variables, the relationships between variables that are not related to your research question. We want to know what's predicting burnout and burnout alone. So then what we can do is see, okay, burnout. Well, let's look at the relationships between burnout and all of these other things. K still tells us the number of studies that we have. So with this burnout variable, they aggregated 27 studies. The relationship between burnout and job demands aggregated 27 individual studies with correlations. The samples of each of those individual studies, so the number of participants that they included in each of those individual studies is also aggregated. And cumulatively, these 27 studies aggregated what ended up being 16,000 people's data. So a lot. It's a really, really big sample. This is why meta-analyses are so powerful. Then we see R. R is the symbol for correlation. You can also look here and see they explain what R is. R is a sample-weighted correlation, which means that in the aggregation process, we gave more weight to bigger samples. We don't need to worry about that. We just want to know that this is an aggregate correlation. In the case of meta-analysis, it's going to be. Now, you also have this other symbol here that looks like a fancy P looking thing. This is called rho. And rho is the estimated true correlation correcting for sampling error and unreliability. There's a fancy way, if you're doing a meta-analysis, to remove error from the statistic. So it gives you a more precise indication of the relationship than just a regular correlation. They're both correlations. They both can be interpreted in the same way. Okay. If you see R or rho, you can use either, but I would encourage you to try to use rho instead. So then what we can do is we can look at burnout, the rho, the burnout rho, the rho in terms of the table, not the statistic. And we can cross it with the statistic rho, the aggregate correlation that's corrected for error. And we see that the effect size is 0.27. So what does 0.27 mean? Is this important? Is this not important? We know that it's positive. And so because it's positive, that means that as job demands increase, burnout increases as well. We also get a strength of the association. So is job demands and burnout strongly associated with each other, weakly associated with each other, moderately associated with each other? This is where we turn back to our cheat sheet here. And in this cheat sheet, you see every type of effect size that you'll probably find in your articles. And you can just search for the right effect size here. And then there's the interpretation of it next to the effect size itself. So we could look at a correlation, but actually we could just, we have row as well. The interpretation is the same. They're both basically a correlation. One's just a little bit more precise. Row is a little bit more precise than a regular correlation, but still the size of it and the direction of it and all that is the same interpretation. So what we also have here is whether or not the effect is small, medium, or large. Here, small, medium, or large. And then we have kind of this description of what a correlation tells us. In our case, a correlation tells us how strongly associated two variables are, and it tells us the direction of the association. So it can be positive or negative, strong, medium, or weak. So what we'll do is we'll compare row 0.27 to these benchmarks for small, medium, and large. And we see that the relationship is medium. It's close to medium. It's okay that it's a little bit below 0.30. It's 0.27, but it's close enough. So what we would say here is that job demands are moderately positively associated with burnout, such that when someone has more job demands, they have more burnout. The other piece of information that we want to look for in our results. So effect sizes, that's one, that's practical significance. That's what we just did. A correlation is an effect size. And we want to know if it's small, medium, or large. Because if there's something that has a really big effect, then that's more important to us than something that has a really small effect. The other thing that we'll look at is the p-value, statistical significance. So this just tells us whether or not it's likely that our results were just due to chance and not really actually due to a true effect existing out there. So are our results most likely different from zero if we were to look at the population? And there's a more detailed description here as well. We don't have p-values directly in this table because instead what they do is 95% confidence intervals. The 95% confidence interval tells us the likelihood that that our correlation or row is within a certain band. So a 95% confidence interval says we are 95% sure that our correlation is between 0.22 and 0.32. This does not include zero, so we can be confident that our correlation or row is likely to be different than zero and is therefore statistically significant. So what you would look for is the confidence interval. Does it include zero or not? And in this case, it doesn't include zero. We can have some trust in this results, and we know that it's a medium effect. So in terms of the types of notes that we would take and what we would put in our write-up, we could say job demands have a moderately strong relationship with burnout, moderately strong and positive relationship with burnout. The relationship is statistically significant. So that helps us a little bit But we actually need to look at these other relationships as well. So we can look at challenge demands and hindrance demands to see which of these types of demands are more important or more relevant. So the challenge demands, actually, when we do the same exercise and we see these broken up different types of demands, we see the challenge demands have a smaller relationship with burnout. And I'm sorry, this is row. We'll use row because we have the option. So it's 0.61. We go back to our interpretation cheat sheet here, and we see that 0.61 for correlation or for row is pretty close to small effect. So when we break it up into these two different types of demands, then the challenge demands are not as strongly associated with burnout as the hindrance demands most likely will be. So that would be something that we would take note of. And we can do the same thing, confidence interval. We're 95% sure that the correlation is between 0.10 and 0.22. Let's then look at hindrance demands as the other type of demand. And there we see that the row is 0.30. So it's those hindrance demands that are giving us more of a problem with burnout than the challenge demands. And we would want to know how they're defining that from the introduction, that the challenge demands are something that it sounds like can give you an ability to demonstrate competency, whereas a hindrance demand is something that is in your way, something that takes up time and you don't get rewarded for. You can think of many. Okay, and that we're 95% sure that the relationship between hindrance demands and burnout is between 0.23 and 0.37. Okay, so that would tell us that one of the stronger predictors of burnout for these two types of demands is hindrance demands. And you can describe that in your results. You can describe both and say this is stronger. Hindrance demands are stronger than challenge demands. Then we can do the same thing for resources. And we see here that resources have a negative relationship. That makes sense. It's 0.27, oddly, same relationship as the challenge demands overall for row, negative 0.27. And these interpretations work in both positive and negative forms. So the negative 0.27, it's around this 0.3 mark. It's just inverse. And we would say it's a resources have a moderately strong and negative relationship with burnout. We go back to the results. We see that the 95% confidence interval does not include 0. So it's statistically significant again. This means as resources increase, burnout decreases. So all of that is what you want to pay attention to for your meta-analysis. You don't really need to worry about some of this other stuff that they have. You don't need to read every single part of the results section. You don't even really